I'm going to be doing just a little bit of finishing work on the energy shield for Doctor Strange. I've been doing the large 16-inch Hulk. Now I'm working on Doctor Strange of the same scale. He won't be quite as tall, I don't think, but I should probably silence my phone a little bit, huh? There we go. Right, so we've got Doctor Strange shield here. I have printed it in PETG. I actually printed it at a funky angle. Let's see if I can orient it here. I actually printed out just like that on the print bed. So at about a 40-degree angle from the bed, and that allowed these details to be printed super fine with minimal cleanup. I've just been, I've hit it with a few coats of filler primer. I did do some putty work on the back because that's where all the support was, which is fine because it kept it out of the details. That was the important thing. But now I get to go back through and do just a little bit more cleanup before I get ready to airbrush it, because I'm really liking playing with the airbrush. So, I know in the past I've used my little engraving tool that I picked up for $1. That thing is fantastic, and I've used that a little bit on this. I also picked up a little mini, it says Drill Master, but it's basically a little Dremel that came with a ton of these little metal tips. So I've been playing with the different little metal tips to get into this fine detail, to just clean up what little print lines and things that I've needed to. Most of it actually printed out really well, and I didn't have to sand much of any of it. But now that I have done all that cleanup, I've got a few little things that just didn't fill in. And you can kind of see it right there where my thumb is. There's a little line that just didn't fill in properly. Another tiny little hole there, tiny little hole over there. And these are things that just are not going to fill in with the filler primer unless I just glob it on there, and really don't want to do that. That just takes away the detail from other things. So I'm going to start with a little bit of my glazing putty. And I'm going to use a paintbrush, but the other end of it. This is actually just going to be so I can get in there tighter than I can with my fingers. And I put just a tiny, tiny little dab on there. And I'm going to dab that on the hole and use that to kind of smooth it over. So it's filled in the hole, but not really made a big glob on top. Just clean. Grab just a tiny, tiny little bit more. You can see how tiny of amount that is. And see if I can get it into the other little hole there. And I did. Now I'm going to flip it around. I'm going to drag the bristles across the detail a little bit and see if I can smooth that out as best I can so that it's still filled in. Yeah, you can see it's still filled in without messing up the detail. So I'm going to do this last little bit. I'm going to clean off my brush tip again. I'm going to grab just a tiny little bit again and get into the detail here. And brush that in. Oh hey, we got somebody watching. I'm just doing some very fine cleanup with glazing putty here. Alright, so I put just a tiny little bit on. We're going to sand some of this back off when it's dry. We're just filling in what little tiny bit doesn't fill in with that filler primer, and it just showed up a little bit after applying it. So Just the tiniest application of this. Most of what we put on comes back off. So that's all I'm doing here, is trying to get as much off as I can before it's dry. You can see I didn't even put all of it on there that I had on my brush. So I'm just going to inspect it and see if there's any more little tiny holes. I can get this thing. Oh, I can actually make it focus. There. What brand of filler primer? I think all my cans are up there, but in the garage, I used Rust-Oleum, the 2-in-1 filler primer. That's filler sandable primer. They do also make just a filler primer, but it's not as easy to sand. So make sure you get the one that's the 2-in-1. Alright, I think, because I'm going to have to hit this with one more coat, anything else that I'm seeing here will probably fill in just fine and isn't really worth trying to touch up. As you can see, this detail in here is really tiny and really fine, and that's why I used this little kind of like a rounded tip, almost like a teardrop shape. It's got a real fine point on it, but it also, that teardrop allows you to kind of flatten out and hit some of the, like an edge. On this print, I did actually get my printers are dialed in now, so I'm printing PETG at 0.15 millimeter layer heights, and it has made a huge difference in the quality. Let's see, I've got some other raw parts sitting here I can show off. Set that down. There we go. If I can get it to focus for you. Come on. It's not wanting to focus very well. There it goes. You can see there's not really any print lines. There's one little band there at the bottom, but you know, this looks just like it was printed in, you know, a high quality PLA or something. You know, that's a texture in the model that you're seeing here, but there's really no print lines. And the detail on things like the hands came out really well too. I did just a minimal amount of cleanup. This hand, actually, I should have printed it a little bit different angle, but you can see there's some overhang that I had to deal with there. But those little tiny fingers came out really well. And then, of course, the sides here. And then I do have some of the other pieces for them, getting ready. This is another one that I printed out at 0.15, and it just turned out so nice. There's some print lines, just a tiny little bit, but a lot of that's actually because of all the support material that I used in this. I used a lot of it just because this model printed like this, and there was a lot of things that I really didn't want to risk not turning out right. So I did add quite a bit of support, but I think it turned out pretty good. Another piece I'm working on finishing for it right now is the cape. which is very large. And this is 2 pieces, and I'm working on doing the seam right now. So you can see I've glued it together. I've used a fair amount of the glazing putty because one of my pieces just really, it didn't turn out as well as I was hoping. So I instead of reprinting a 20-hour print, I went ahead and just used some glazing putty and fixed it that way. The seams here should hopefully completely disappear. And you can see I've got little bits that show dark. Those are the spots that when sanding it just never touched it. So that means I get to add more putty where you see it really dark. And usually when I do that, I'll grab a piece of paper. Usually use like paper or cardstock, anything like that. We can smooth it out. Let me move some stuff out of the way for this giant piece. Alright, just tear off a fresh piece of paper. And I'm going to run it across here. And across here. Just smoothing that out as much as I can. And we're going to have to do several passes over this to get that seam to really disappear. Now you don't want to drag flat up like this because then you're just going to sink into the actual groove itself. You need to go at an angle so that it glides over that seam. We'll let that little section dry. Let's see if we can get it to focus again. And I can move on to some other parts on it. This one had some more dark spots here. I can just see where it didn't quite fill in yet, and that's all right. We're just going to build that up slowly. A nice coating of it on there. I'll do the same thing here. I'm going to go opposite direction of the actual seam. You can see it's going to take off material here. So I can do this so the camera can see it. Basically scraping away the excess so that only what's in the seam remains for the most part. As I said, this will be multi-layers that we'll do on this. And you can really see that color difference here. You know, this is a spot that has not been sanded, and this is a spot that has. You can see the color difference of how dark this is compared to this here. And that's your telltale sign of what didn't get hit by the sandpaper. So while all this on the seam is drying, I can take some sandpaper here and show you that. you can see a pretty defined difference there now. You can see the print is just barely starting to show through here. There's actually still a fine layer of this glazing putty over it. And that's where you stop. You don't want to go past that. You can see more areas where that's starting to come through. Once you get an area to that, you move on to the next. And here you'll see there's some of the white showing through, but there's also some darker areas where the sandpaper never touched. It just means I need to build up some more putty there. Is that are you asking about like it's like a resin kind of stuff that you put on? I've not tried that, only because I've heard some horror stories about it. It does chew up some of your detail because it's a real thick resin coating that you put on. It does work, but like I said, it'll hide some of your details. But then it also does some other things too. If you ever worked with a lot of resin, it's kind of fragile when it's really a thin coating like that. I've heard that it can be pretty brittle on coating of parts like that, but I have not personally got a chance to work with it. It's kind of pricey, so I'm not sure I ever will. Unless I find out it comes down in price or somebody sends some to me, try it out, then I might try it. And I'm sure it has some really good uses too, as far as certain applications and certain prints. This is the fun, laborious part. Alright, so I don't bore you too much on that part. I will actually grab the energy shield again, because I'm sure it is dry. And I'll see if I can just take a tiny little bit of the sandpaper. Is that 100% of the file? Actually, this is at 250%. That's the same I did with the Hulk files. I did those at 250%. Okay, I'm seeing this is almost kind of scratching with this sandpaper, so I'm going to switch to something a little finer. I'm going to grab a 240 here. which is usually what I would use, but that the Cape has a lot a lot of glazing putty on it for once. I usually try to put it on pretty smooth, but like I said, that print was kind of messed up, so it took a little more than usual. And I am just trying to hit this as light as I can with this sandpaper. I'm not putting hardly any pressure on it. I'm just barely cleaning it up. Luckily, we did take most of it back off when we put on the glazing putty earlier. So there is minimal to clean up now. Alright, for the most part that's cleaned up. There is a small little bit in the detail work that I need to just pull just a little bit out of. So I'm going to turn this on. It's going to be loud, so I apologize ahead of time. I'll give you a second to turn on your volume if you need to. Okay, so I'm just going to be using the very tip here. There we go. I don't know if you could hear it over the sound of the tool itself, but I was just barely touching inside of that detail. Just putting very small amount of pressure at all. There's the back side. It actually still needs another coat of primer, but most of that won't be seen. It goes on here a very specific way. That. So there we are, ready for another coat of filler primer. So just a little short video for today on some of the cleanup work, but just thought I'd go ahead and get a video going. So until next time on Bad Wolf Props, see you guys later.